Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In a remote village tucked into the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, there was a craftsman named Victor. Known for his extraordinary skill in creating masks, Victor's work was sought after by nobles and performers alike. Every mask he made seemed to hold a story, as though it were alive. One day, a mysterious traveler entered Victor's shop. The man wore a dark cloak, his face obscured by shadows, and he spoke with a voice like gravel scraping on stone. "I've heard of your talent," the traveler said. "I require a mask unlike any you have ever made, one that reveals the truth hidden behind false faces." Victor, both intrigued and unsettled, agreed to the challenge. Over the next month, he poured his heart and soul into the mask. He used silver filigree, polished onyx and rare pearls, crafting it to perfection. But as he worked, strange things began to happen. Shadows seemed to move on their own in his workshop. Whispers echoed in empty corners, and his dreams were haunted by images of distorted faces. When the mask was finally complete, the traveler returned. "Your work is flawless," he said, placing a heavy coin pouch on the table. "But beware. This mask sees all, and what it reveals cannot be unseen." With that, the man vanished, leaving Victor with an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. Years later, the mask found its way into the possession of a wealthy baroness named Emilia Voss. Known for her opulent parties, Emilia decided to host a masquerade ball to celebrate her birthday. When she stumbled upon the mask in a dusty antiques shop, she knew it would be the centerpiece of the evening. The mask was striking, silver with dark inlays and eye holes that seemed impossibly deep. Guests whispered about its beauty as Emilia wore it proudly, her gown sparkling under the chandeliers of her grand estate. As the night went on, Emilia began to notice something peculiar. The faces of her guests seemed to shift when she looked at them through the mask. At first, the changes were subtle. A guest who was known for her radiant beauty appeared with hollow eyes and cracked lips. Her smile warped into a sneer. Another, a charming young man who had spent the evening flattering Emilia, had his face replaced by a grotesque mask of greed, his hands clutching at invisible riches. Startled, Emilia removed the mask and blinked. The guests appeared normal again, their laughter and chatter filling the ballroom. "It's just the wine," she whispered to herself, brushing off the strange visions. But curiosity gnawed at her. She slipped the mask back on and scanned the room again. The transformations became more pronounced. People she trusted appeared as monsters, their true natures laid bare. Her closest friend, Sophia, stood by the buffet table, her reflection in the mask revealing a face twisted with jealousy, her eyes green as emeralds. Emilia became obsessed. Over the next few weeks, she used the mask at every opportunity, testing its power on everyone she met. Servants, friends, business associates, none were spared her scrutiny. What she saw disturbed her. Her loyal butler, who had served her family for decades, appeared as a shadowy figure with dagger-like hands. Her financial advisor, whom she had trusted with her fortune, bore the face of a raven, his beak dripping with coins. The mask revealed truths she had never wanted to see. Trust crumbled and paranoia consumed her. She dismissed servants, cut ties with friends, and locked herself away in her estate, the mask always within reach. One stormy evening, as Emilia sat alone in her dimly lit study, the mask resting on the desk before her, a knock echoed through the empty halls. When she opened the door, a cloaked figure stood on the threshold. It was the same traveler who had commissioned the mask from Victor so many years ago. "You've seen too much," he said, his voice as haunting as the night they met. "The mask was not meant for you." Emilia clutched the mask protectively. "It's mine," she hissed. You can't take it from me." The man tilted his head, his shadowed face unreadable. "Do you even know what you've become? The mask doesn't just show the truth of others. It changes those who use it. Look for yourself." Trembling, Amelia lifted the mask and turned it toward a nearby mirror. For a moment she hesitated. Then with a deep breath, she looked. The reflection that stared back at her was unrecognizable. Her once beautiful face was gaunt and hollow, her eyes sunken and glowing with an unnatural light. Her hands were clawed, clutching the mask as though it were a lifeline. "No," she whispered, dropping the mask. It hit the floor with a metallic clang, but the damage was done. "You've let it consume you," the traveler said. "Now, you belong to it." As the traveler faded into the night, Emilia felt the mask calling to her. No matter how far she tried to distance herself from it, the pull was irresistible. Finally, she gave in, placing it on her face one last time. The mask fused to her skin, its silver edges sinking into her flesh. She screamed, but no one was there to hear her. When the servants returned the next morning, they found the estate empty. Amelia Voss was never seen again. The mask resurfaced decades later, found by an unsuspecting collector in an abandoned estate. Its surface was tarnished, but the dark inlays still gleamed with a sinister allure. The collector, drawn to its beauty, brought it home, placing it on a shelf among other artifacts. That night, as he admired his new acquisition, he thought he heard whispers, faint, haunting, and filled with the weight of untold truths. The cycle began again. The carnival appeared without warning. One day, the rolling fields outside the town of Black Hollow were empty. The next, they were filled with vibrant tents, flashing lights, and the distant sound of calliope music. Nobody had seen it arrive, and no one in the town recognized the performers who wandered the streets, handing out crimson tickets marked with the words, "Come see your future, one night only." The townsfolk, curious and hungry for distraction, flocked to the carnival as twilight fell. Among the usual rides, sideshows, and games of chance, there was one attraction that everyone whispered about, but no one admitted to visiting: the Game of Fate. Hidden in the farthest corner of the carnival, the Game of Fate was a modest booth, draped in dark, tattered fabric. A sign above the entrance read, "The booth was manned by a single attendant, an elderly man with hollow cheeks and piercing gray eyes. His hands were skeletal, his nails yellowed, and he spoke in a voice that seemed to echo as though it came from the bottom of a deep well. Step right up, brave souls. One spin is all it takes to see what the future holds." The game itself was simple. A spinning wheel divided into segments, each painted with cryptic symbols: an hourglass, a skull, a crow, a broken chain, and more. For a single coin, players could spin the wheel and receive a card predicting their future. Few dared to approach. Those who did returned pale and shaken, clutching small black cards they refused to share with anyone. Ellie Harper, a young woman with a sharp wit and an insatiable curiosity, was one of the many who visited the carnival that night. She had come with her younger brother, Sam, and their group of friends. As the evening wore on, they heard murmurs about the Game of Fate. "No way am I going near that thing," Sam said, shaking his head. "People say it's cursed." "Cursed or just clever marketing?" Ellie smirked. "It's probably some gimmick to scare people." Her friends laughed nervously, but Ellie was already intrigued. After wandering the carnival and trying a few other attractions, she found herself standing before the dark stall, staring at the spinning wheel. The old man grinned when he saw her. "Curious, aren't you?" he rasped. Ellie hesitated. The stall seemed to hum with an eerie energy, but she couldn't resist. She handed over a coin and stepped up to the wheel. The wheel spun with a metallic clatter, the symbols blurring together. Ellie's heart raced as it slowed, finally stopping on an hourglass. The old man reached beneath the counter and handed her a black card. It was blank at first, but as she stared, golden letters shimmered into view. "The sands are slipping. Beware the river. What does it mean, she asked, but the old man only smiled and waved her away. Her friends teased her when she returned, calling it nonsense. Beware the river? What, are you supposed to stay away from water now? Ellie laughed along with them, but unease gnawed at her. The next morning, news spread through Black Hollow. A man had drowned in the river. He had been a local farmer, one of the few brave enough to spin the wheel the night before. His card had read, "The water will claim you." Ellie's stomach churned. The coincidence was too eerie to ignore. Over the next few days, more deaths followed, each one aligning with the cryptic warnings on the black cards. A young woman who had drawn the symbol of a crow fell from her horse while riding through the woods. Her card had read, "Wings above, shadows below." Panic began to grip the town. Ellie couldn't stop thinking about her own card, the river. What if it wasn't a metaphor? She avoided the river entirely, even going out of her way to avoid bridges and streams. But no matter how careful she was, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching her. One night she dreamed of the carnival. In the dream, the old man stood in the center of a dark void, the spinning wheel glowing in front of him. "You can't escape fate," he whispered. Ellie woke up drenched in sweat. Desperate for answers, Ellie returned to the site where the carnival had been. But the fields were empty, with no sign it had ever been there. Determined, she sought out the other survivors who had spun the wheel. Together, they pieced together what they knew. The card's warnings always came true. The deaths were inevitable, no matter what precautions were taken. The wheel seemed to feed on their fear. "I'm not going to wait around for it to happen," Ellie declared. Ellie traveled to nearby towns, asking if anyone had seen the carnival. Months passed and she nearly gave up hope, until she stumbled upon it in a distant village. The game of fate stood in its shadowy corner, exactly as she remembered. The old man's grin widened when he saw her. "Back so soon? I want to spin again," Ellie said, slamming a coin onto the counter. The old man raised an eyebrow but gestured to the wheel. Ellie spun it with all her might, watching as it landed on a broken chain. The card appeared in her hand. "Only the brave break the cycle." Ellie realized what she had to do. She took the card and ripped it in half. The old man screamed, his voice distorting into an inhuman wail. The booth shook, the spinning wheel splintering as golden light burst from its center. When Ellie opened her eyes, the carnival was gone. Back in Black Hollow, the deaths stopped. People spoke of Ellie as a hero, but she never shared the details of what had happened. Years later, while walking through the woods, Ellie found a single black card lying on the ground. It read, "The cycle begins anew." The old mansion on Ashmere Hill had been abandoned for decades, its windows dark and its walls wrapped in ivy like a shroud. Locals whispered about its sinister past, a place where reality warped and people vanished without a trace. They called it the Nightmare House. Stories about the house stretched back generations. Some said it had been a boarding school where children disappeared. Others claimed it was once the home of a recluse who dabbled in dark magic. But the one thing everyone agreed on was this: those who entered the house never returned the same, if they returned at all. No one had dared to approach Ashmere House in years, until a group of 5 curious strangers, bound together by chance, decided to uncover its secrets. It began as a dare during a chance meeting at a local inn. Rachel, a skeptical journalist, had been investigating urban legends for her column. Ethan, an aspiring filmmaker, wanted footage for his horror documentary. Tasha, a thrill-seeking adventurer, sought her next adrenaline rush. James and Olivia, a young couple traveling through the area, were intrigued by the idea of exploring the infamous house. After a few drinks and exchanged stories, they decided to explore Ashmere House together. Each had their own reasons, some professional, some personal, but none truly believed the house could be as terrifying as the legends claimed. The group arrived at Ashmere House under a pale, waning moon. The air felt heavier as they approached. and the wind carried a faint, eerie hum. The rusted gate creaked as Ethan pushed it open, the sound reverberating like a warning. Inside, the house was eerily intact. Dust coated the furniture and cobwebs hung like curtains, but the structure itself felt alive, as if the walls were watching. At the center of the foyer stood a grand staircase, its railings twisted into grotesque shapes. But what truly caught their attention were the doors, dozens of them. Some doors were small and unassuming, others were massive, with intricate carvings. None were marked, and none gave any hint of what lay beyond. "Which one should we try first?" Tasha asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe we stick together," Rachel suggested, but the house had other plans. Before anyone could decide, James stepped forward, drawn to a simple wooden door on the right. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, twisting the knob. As soon as the door opened, a powerful force yanked him inside. The others screamed, rushing to pull him back, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "James!" Olivia cried, pounding on the door. But when she opened it again, James was gone. The room beyond was completely different, a cavernous, empty space filled with an oppressive red mist. A faint echo of James's voice called out, distant and terrified, before fading into silence. Panic set in. "We have to leave," Olivia begged, but the front door wouldn't budge. The house had sealed them in. Driven by desperation, Ethan opened another door. This time, the group stayed together as they stepped inside. They found themselves in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls pulsed like living flesh, and the air smelled of rot. Shadows moved just beyond their vision, whispering unintelligible words. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of screams. Hands reached out from the walls, clawing at them as they ran back toward the door. When they stumbled back into the foyer, Olivia noticed her hands were stained with blood, though none of it was hers. Each door led to a different nightmare. Rachel opened a door and found herself in a blizzard of ash, her lungs burning as unseen figures stalked her. Tasha tried another door and was plunged into an endless ocean, with ghostly faces staring up at her from beneath the waves. Ethan opened a door that led to a room filled with mirrors. In each reflection, he saw a twisted, decaying version of himself, grinning maniacally. No matter where they went, the doors always brought them back to the foyer. But each time they returned, something had changed. The walls grew darker, the air colder, and the shadows deeper. As the hours passed, they realized the house wasn't just toying with them, it was feeding on their fear. The more terrified they became, the stronger the house grew. Rachel found a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It belonged to a man named Victor Ashmere, the original owner of the house. His writings revealed that the house was a gateway to a realm of nightmares, a prison for a malevolent entity that thrived on human terror. "I tried to seal it," Victor had written, "but the house has a will of its own. Only those who face their greatest fear can escape." The group devised a plan. Each of them would open a door, face what lay beyond, and try to resist the fear. Rachel went first. She stepped through a door and found herself in a newsroom, watching a version of herself humiliated in front of her peers. She closed her eyes, repeated Victor's words, and stepped forward. The vision dissolved, and she returned to the foyer. Ethan faced his reflection again, but this time he smashed the mirrors, shouting, "You're not me!" The glass shattered, and he emerged unscathed. One by one, they confronted their nightmares, growing stronger with each step. But Olivia hesitated. "I can't do this without James," she whispered. "You have to try," Tasha urged. Olivia opened the final door and found herself in a field of graves. James stood at the far end, waving to her. "Come with me," he called. Tears streamed down her face as she realized it wasn't really him. She turned away, whispering, "Goodbye." The graves crumbled, and she stepped back into the foyer where the others were waiting. With the final nightmare defeated, the house began to collapse. Doors slammed shut, walls crumbled, and a deafening roar filled the air. The group ran toward the front door, which finally opened. They stumbled out into the night, gasping for air as the house imploded behind them, leaving nothing but a patch of scorched earth. Though they had escaped, none of them were ever the same. They never spoke of what they had seen, and they never returned to Ashmere Hill. But sometimes, late at night, they could still hear the faint creak of a door opening and the whispers of the house calling them back. It started with a birthday. 8-year-old Lily Thomas loved dolls. Her room was a shrine to them. Porcelain dolls with delicate features, rag dolls with sewn smiles, and plastic ones with blinking eyes. But none of them had ever been as unique as the one she unwrapped that year. The doll was about 12 inches tall, dressed in a faded green dress trimmed with lace. Its face was eerily lifelike, with glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow you, and a small, almost knowing smile. What stood out most was its voice. A pull string at the back activated a soft, childlike whisper. "Tell me your secrets." Lily adored it instantly, naming it Annabelle after her grandmother. But as the days passed, the doll's whispers became more than just a pre-programmed phrase. Lily's parents, Emma and David, didn't think much of the doll at first. They dismissed it as another one of their daughter's toys. But one night, as Emma tucked Lily into bed, she heard Lily whispering to Annabelle. "What are you telling her, sweetie?" Emma asked, amused. "Just secrets," Lily said with a giggle. Emma smiled and kissed her forehead, not thinking much of it. But later that evening, as she prepared for bed, she found herself startled by a quiet sound. "Tell me your secrets," a faint voice whispered. Emma turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. She shook her head, blaming her imagination, and went to sleep. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Emma found a piece of paper on the kitchen counter with a note written in a childlike scrawl. "Mom took money from Dad's wallet." Emma froze. It was true. She'd taken some cash for groceries the week before without mentioning it. But how could Lily know? "Did you write this?" she asked Lily, holding up the note. Lily shook her head. "No, Mommy. Maybe Annabelle did." Emma's stomach twisted uncomfortably. Then it was David's turn. He came home late one evening, his tie loosened and his face flushed. Emma frowned at the faint smell of perfume that wasn't hers. "Long day?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, avoiding her gaze. The next morning, Lily came downstairs holding Annabelle, her expression unreadable. "Daddy kissed a lady who isn't Mommy," she said. David dropped his coffee mug. Tensions in the Thomas household escalated. Secrets began spilling out, seemingly without cause. Emma discovered a note in Lily's handwriting describing private conversations she'd had with her sister. David found a slip of paper on his desk detailing his work troubles, issues he'd told no one about. All the while, Annabelle sat in her usual spot on Lily's shelf, her glassy eyes unblinking and her smile fixed. One evening, Emma decided she'd had enough. "Lily, have you been writing these notes?" she demanded. "No," Lily insisted. "Annabelle knows things. I just tell her my secrets, and she tells me stuff back." "Stuff like what?" Lily hesitated. "She told me you and Daddy fight because you don't love each other anymore." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "That's not true," she said, but her voice wavered. Lily hugged Annabelle tightly. "She only whispers the truth, Mommy." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. She tossed and turned until she heard it, a faint whisper drifting down the hall. "Tell me your secrets." Emma bolted upright. She tiptoed toward Lily's room, pushing the door open quietly. Lily was sound asleep, but Annabelle was sitting upright on the bed, her head tilted slightly. Emma stepped closer, her heart pounding. She reached out and picked up the doll, examining it closely. The pull string at the back looked ordinary enough, But something about the doll's weight felt wrong. She tugged the string. "Tell me your secrets," the doll whispered, but this time the voice seemed deeper, almost mocking. Emma shoved the doll back onto the shelf and left the room, feeling its gaze on her back the entire time. Over the next week, the family unraveled. David became increasingly defensive, accusing Emma of planting the notes to sabotage him. Emma, in turn, accused David of hiding more than just late nights. Lily grew quieter, retreating into her room with Annabelle. When Emma tried to take the doll away, Lily screamed, "No, she'll get mad!" "She's just a doll," Emma shouted back. But Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "She's my friend. She knows everything." That night, the whispers grew louder. Emma and David both heard them, faint but unmistakable. Emma lied to David. David betrayed Emma. Lily doesn't trust either of them. By morning, neither parent could deny the doll's sinister presence. Desperate for answers, Emma researched the doll's origins. She learned it had belonged to a woman named Margaret Hensley, who had died mysteriously decades ago. Locals claim Margaret had been obsessed with secrets, blackmailing her neighbors with the information she somehow uncovered. When Margaret died, her spirit was said to have latched onto her most prized possession, a handmade doll. It was rumored that the doll carried Margaret's essence, listening, learning, and revealing the truths people wanted to keep hidden. Emma and David decided to destroy the doll. They grabbed Annabelle from Lily's room and brought her to the backyard, dousing her in lighter fluid. As the flames consumed the doll, Lily screamed from the house, "Stop it! She's angry!" The fire roared unnaturally high, and for a moment, Emma thought she heard a scream, a human scream, emanating from the flames. When the fire died, only ashes remained. The family tried to move on, but the damage was done. Emma and David divorced within months. Lily refused to speak about Annabelle, though she occasionally mentioned hearing whispers in her dreams. Years later, a box of Lily's childhood belongings ended up at a thrift store. Inside, buried beneath old toys and clothes, was a charred scrap of green fabric. And late one night, the shopkeeper swore he heard a faint voice whisper, "Tell me your secrets." Galloway was an unremarkable town, nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by dense woods. It had the usual amenities, a post office, a diner, a school, but what set Galloway apart was its town square. At the center of the square stood an old stone fountain adorned with a statue of a cloaked figure holding an empty lantern. Surrounding it were cobblestone paths, neatly trimmed hedges, and benches worn smooth by time. But the square was peculiar, almost unnerving. No matter the time of day, no shadows ever appeared there. It didn't matter if the sun blazed overhead or if the moon cast its silvery glow. Light touched everything, yet nothing cast a shadow. The townsfolk rarely spoke of the shadowless square. It was simply accepted, like the changing seasons or the turning of the clock. But visitors, those who came to Galloway by accident or curiosity, couldn't help but feel the air grow heavier as they approached it. Mia Rogers arrived in Galloway on a bright spring afternoon. A journalist by trade, she'd heard rumors of the strange square and decided to investigate. She parked her car on the outskirts of town and walked along the cobblestone streets, camera slung over her shoulder and notebook in hand. The square came into view, and Mia immediately felt a chill run down her spine. The sunlight was harsh, illuminating every corner of the space, yet there were no shadows. She stepped closer, her eyes darting from the statue to the surrounding buildings, searching for some logical explanation. "It's strange, isn't it?" Mia turned to see an elderly man sitting on a nearby bench. His eyes were clouded with age, but his gaze was sharp. "Excuse me?" Mia asked. "The square," he said. "You're not the first to wonder about it." "What's the story behind it?" Mia pressed, eager for information. The man hesitated before responding. "Some things are better left alone." Mia wasn't one to leave mysteries unsolved. She spent the next few days interviewing townsfolk, but most were reluctant to talk about the square. The few who did shared vague warnings. "It's always been like that," said Mary, the owner of the diner. "My grandmother used to say it was cursed, but I think it's just one of those things. People who spend too much time there, they change," whispered a young man at the library. Determined to uncover the truth, Mia visited the local archives. There, buried in dusty records, she found a curious tale dating back to the 1700s. Galloway had once been home to a reclusive alchemist named Elias Greaves. According to legend, Elias was obsessed with harnessing light and darkness. He built the fountain in the square as part of a grand experiment, though no one knew its purpose. Shortly after the fountain's completion, Elias vanished, and the square became shadowless. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mia returned to the square. She wanted to observe it at night, hoping to capture something unusual on her camera. The square was eerily quiet, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. She walked to the fountain and ran her fingers over the cold stone. Her camera clicked as she took several photographs, but when Mia reviewed the pictures, her heart stopped. The photos showed her standing in the square, but there was something wrong. Her shadow was missing. She turned off the camera, her breathing quickening. "It's just a trick of the light," she muttered, trying to calm herself. But as she turned to leave, she heard a sound. A faint whisper, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the statue. "Stay." Mia froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading. She spun around, but the square was empty. Over the next few days, Mia became obsessed with the fountain. She spent hours researching Elias Greaves, uncovering fragments of his experiments. He had been fascinated by the concept of shadow as a soul, a belief that shadows were more than mere reflections, that they were tied to a person's essence. One cryptic note in Elias's journal caught her attention. "To banish the shadows is to imprison the soul." Determined to learn more, Mia returned to the square one final time. This time she brought a flashlight and a crowbar, intending to examine the fountain more closely. As she pried at the base of the statue, a hidden compartment opened, revealing a small ornate lantern. Its glass panels were dark, but it pulsed faintly when Mia touched it, as if alive. The whispers grew louder. "Release us!" Mia carried the lantern back to her motel, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. She set it on the desk and stared at it, her mind racing. The whispers continued, more distinct now. Voices pleaded, cried, and begged for freedom. She realized the horrifying truth. Elias Greaves hadn't just banished shadows from the square, he had trapped them, along with the souls they belonged to, inside the lantern. The shadowless square wasn't a marvel of alchemy, it was a prison. Mia faced a dilemma. She could destroy the lantern, freeing the trapped souls but risking unknown consequences, or she could leave it intact, preserving the uneasy balance in Galloway. The voices grew more insistent. "Please, help us! End this!" Unable to ignore their pleas, Mia smashed the lantern against the floor. A blinding light filled the room, and the whispers turned to wails. Shadows erupted from the broken glass, swirling chaotically before vanishing. When the light faded, Mia was alone. The next morning, Mia visited the square. For the first time, shadows stretched across the cobblestones, flickering in the early sunlight. But the townsfolk were uneasy. They spoke of strange occurrences, cold drafts, objects moving on their own, and ghostly figures glimpsed in the corners of their vision. Mia left Galloway shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that she had unleashed something far worse than what had been trapped. As she drove away, the fountain stood silent, the cloaked figure's empty lantern now filled with shadow. And for the first time in centuries, its shadow stretched across the square. When Eleanor Whitmore received the letter from the estate lawyer, she didn't know what to expect. Her Aunt Agnes, a woman she barely knew, had passed away, leaving Eleanor her old Victorian house in the countryside. It wasn't a grand inheritance, more of a burden, Eleanor thought. The house was dilapidated, creaking under the weight of time, but it was hers now. Eager to sort through the place and decide its fate, Eleanor packed her bags and drove out to the sprawling, lonely property. As she walked through the dusty halls, memories of her few childhood visits trickled back. Aunt Agnes's stern face, the smell of lavender and mothballs, and the unsettling creaks and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The house felt heavy with history, but one room in particular drew her attention: the upstairs guest bedroom. It had a peculiar energy about it, one that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The closet in the corner was the focal point, a tall, ornate structure built into the wall, its dark wooden door engraved with intricate, swirling patterns. Eleanor avoided the closet during her initial cleaning, focusing instead on clearing out the rest of the house. Days passed, and each night as she lay in bed, the thought of the closet grew louder in her mind. It was as though it was calling her, demanding her attention. Finally, on the third day, she couldn't resist any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, Eleanor approached the closet. The air around it felt colder, and she hesitated before pulling the door open. Inside, there were no clothes or boxes, just an empty space lined with old, peeling wallpaper. But as her flashlight swept across the interior, Eleanor noticed something odd. The back of the closet wasn't solid. It shimmered faintly, like a heat mirage, and seemed to pulse gently, as though alive. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and the moment her hand touched the surface, she felt a rush of wind and a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was no longer in the guest bedroom. She stood in a lush garden bathed in soft golden light. The air smelled of blooming flowers, and a gentle breeze rustled the trees. It should have been beautiful, but something felt wrong. The garden was eerily silent, devoid of bird song or the hum of insects. In the distance, she could see a swing set, its ropes swaying despite the lack of wind. As Eleanor walked through the garden, she began to feel a strange familiarity. It wasn't until she approached the swing set that she realized why. This was her grandmother's garden, a place she hadn't visited since she was a child. She remembered swinging on that very swing, her grandmother pushing her gently. But her grandmother's house had been sold decades ago, and the garden had long since been replaced by a parking lot. How is this possible? Eleanor whispered. A faint laugh echoed behind her, and she spun around, her heart pounding. There was no one there. Eleanor explored further, her unease growing with every step. The garden began to change, shifting from her grandmother's backyard to other familiar places from her childhood. A park she used to visit, her old elementary school playground, even the narrow alleyway where she'd once scraped her knee. The transitions were seamless, yet disorienting, as though the spaces were stitched together by invisible threads. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the distance. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but as Eleanor approached, she recognized it. It was her, a younger version of herself, no older than 7. The child version of Eleanor stood still, clutching a stuffed rabbit she'd lost decades ago. "Why are you here?" the child asked, her voice soft but accusatory. I don't know," Eleanor stammered. "You shouldn't be here," the child said, and then she vanished. Eleanor's journey through the strange, shifting world of the closet grew darker. The once bright landscapes became shadowed, and the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. She began to see more figures, people from her past, their faces half hidden in shadow. Her father, who had left when she was 10, appeared on a distant hill, his back turned to her. Her childhood best friend, whom she'd lost touch with after a bitter fight, sat by a riverbank, skipping stones. Each time Eleanor tried to approach them, they would vanish. The whispers started then, faint at first but growing louder. They weren't voices she recognized, but they spoke of things she'd forgotten, or perhaps tried to forget. "You broke her heart," one voice said. "You should have said goodbye," another whispered. "You can't escape the past," they chanted together. Eventually, Eleanor found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat jars filled with swirling, luminescent mist. As she approached, she saw that each jar was labeled with a name and a date. She picked one up and gasped. Her own name was etched into the glass, along with the date of her 10th birthday. Curious, she opened the jar, and the mist poured out, enveloping her. She was no longer in the room. Instead, she stood in her childhood home, watching herself blow out the candles on her birthday cake. She remembered that day vividly. Her father had promised to take her to the zoo, but he'd never shown up. As the memory played out, Eleanor felt the pain of that broken promise all over again. When the mist dissipated, she was back in the room, tears streaming down her face. Each jar held a memory, and as Eleanor opened more of them, she was forced to relive moments she had buried deep. Her first heartbreak, the death of her childhood pet, the time she'd lied to her mother and gotten caught. Eleanor realized the closet wasn't just a gateway to forgotten memories. It was a prison for them, a place where the past was stored and preserved, no matter how painful. The whispers grew louder, pleading with her to stay. "You can't leave," they said. "You belong here now." But Eleanor refused to be trapped. She gathered her courage and ran, the jars shattering around her as she moved. The memories swirled in chaos, but she kept going, focusing on the faint shimmer of light in the distance. She burst through the closet door and fell to the floor of the guest bedroom, gasping for air. Eleanor boarded up the closet that night, determined never to open it again. But something had changed within her. The memories she had relived wouldn't fade, and she found herself reflecting on the choices she'd made and the relationships she'd neglected. The closet had forced her to confront her past, but it had also given her a chance to heal. Months later, when she finally sold the house, she left the closet untouched, warning the new owners never to open it. But deep down, she knew the closet would call to someone else someday. After all, the past never stays buried for long. The villagers of Ashwood whispered of a bonfire that burned with cold flames. It was said to appear once every century in the middle of the forest during the longest night of winter. The flames, icy blue and ghostly white, neither warmed nor scorched. Instead, they chilled the soul of anyone who dared to approach. No one knew who or what created the bonfire, but stories passed down through generations claimed it was a gateway to the spirit world, a place where the living and the dead could meet. It was a beacon for restless souls and curious minds, but those who ventured too close often returned, changed if they returned at all. Rowan Cole had always been drawn to mysteries. An amateur folklorist, he spent his days exploring local legends and his nights poring over dusty tomes and faded maps. When he came across an old journal in Ashwood's crumbling library, he felt an electric thrill. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Thorne, who had written about witnessing the cold flames during the winter solstice of 1823. His descriptions were vivid, how the flames danced like spectral figures, how whispers filled the air, and how he saw his deceased wife standing within the fire. But what struck Rowan most was the final entry. "The flames grow colder, pulling me closer. She calls to me. I cannot resist. If I am to be lost, let my name be remembered." Rowan closed the journal with trembling hands. The date of the next solstice was only a week away. The night of the solstice arrived, bringing with it a bitter chill. Rowan packed a satchel with essentials, a flashlight, a notebook, a flask of hot tea, and a silver locket that had belonged to his late mother. He wasn't superstitious, but he felt compelled to bring something personal, just in case. The forest was eerily silent as he trudged through the snow. The trees, black and skeletal, seemed to lean closer with every step. Despite the cold, Rowan felt beads of sweat on his brow, his breath fogging in the freezing air. After what felt like hours, he saw it, a flicker of blue light in the distance. The flames. The bonfire was larger than he'd imagined, its icy flames licking the night sky. The light cast long, shifting shadows across the snow, and the air around it was frigid, stealing the warmth from his body. Rowan hesitated, fear knotting in his stomach, but his curiosity pushed him forward. As Rowan approached, he heard them, the whispers. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs, but as he drew closer, they grew louder, forming words that chilled him more than the air. "Rowan, come closer. Do you seek the truth?" He froze. How did the voices know his name? He looked around, but the forest was empty. The flames danced hypnotically, their cold glow reflecting off the snow. Rowan noticed something moving within the fire, shadows shifting and twisting. They began to take shape, forming figures. One figure stepped forward, her face pale and translucent. Rowan's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother. "Mom," he whispered. She smiled sadly, her eyes filled with longing. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I had to," Rowan replied, stepping closer to the fire. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. "Why are you here? How is this possible?" "This fire, it connects our worlds," she said. "It draws the lost and the curious. But it's dangerous, Rowan. It feeds on those who linger too long." Rowan's mother reached out a hand, and he instinctively reached back. Her fingers were ice cold, and for a moment he felt a pull, like his very essence was being drawn into the flames. "Don't touch her!" a voice shouted. Rowan spun around to see an old man standing at the edge of the clearing. His face was weathered, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Rowan demanded. "My name is Silas," the man said. "I've been watching this fire for years, waiting for it to return. You can't trust what you see in there. It lies." Rowan glanced back at his mother, who looked at him with pleading eyes. "He's wrong," she said. "You can stay with me, Rowan. We can be together again." Silas stepped closer, shaking his head. "That's not your mother. It's the fire playing tricks. If you go in, you won't come back." Rowan felt torn, his mind spinning. Could he trust this stranger, or was the fire truly his chance to reunite with his mother? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the fire itself was alive. "Stay with us, Rowan," they chanted. "Join us. The living world holds nothing for you." Silas grabbed Rowan's arm, pulling him back. "Listen to me, boy. That fire takes your soul and leaves nothing behind. It doesn't matter who you see in there. They're gone. Let them go." Rowan looked at his mother, her expression filled with sorrow. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice trembling. Her form flickered, the image of her face twisting into something darker. "Don't listen to him," she hissed. "I'm your mother. Don't leave me." Rowan stumbled back, his heart pounding. The flames surged, reaching toward him as if alive. He could feel their pull, their icy grip on his soul. Silas dragged him away, shouting over the roar of the fire. "You have to let it go. The fire preys on your grief, your regrets. Don't let it take you." With all his strength, Rowan tore his gaze away from the flames. He let Silas lead him back into the forest, the whispers fading with each step. When they were far enough away, Rowan collapsed in the snow, gasping for air. What was that?" he asked. Silas knelt beside him, his expression grim. "The bonfire appears to those who carry pain in their hearts. It tempts them with what they've lost. But it's a trap. Once it has you, It never lets go. Rowan shivered, not from the cold, but from the memory of his mother's face. Why does it exist? No one knows, Silas said. Some say it's a remnant of an ancient curse. Others think it's a doorway to another world. But one thing is certain, it feeds on the living. Rowan left Ashwood the next day, vowing never to return. But the memory of the cold flames stayed with him, haunting his dreams. He couldn't forget the sight of his mother or the chilling whispers that had almost lured him to his doom. Silas had warned him that the fire would appear again, long after they were gone, to claim new victims. Rowan could only hope that others would resist its pull. As the years passed, Rowan found a measure of peace, but every winter solstice, he lit a small, warm fire in his hearth, a reminder of what he had faced and what he had almost lost. The bonfire of cold flames still burned somewhere in the darkness, waiting for its next visitor. In the heart of Pine Hollow Forest, there was a trail known as Whispering Loop. Locals avoided it, speaking in hushed tones of those who had ventured onto the path and never returned. Stories passed through generations warned of hikers who would wander the trail only to find themselves walking in circles, unable to leave no matter how far they went. Some claimed it was a trick of nature, a confusing maze of identical trees. Others believed it was cursed, a pocket of reality where time and space fractured. Despite the warnings, thrill seekers occasionally tried their luck, confident they could break the loop. None ever did. Emma Waverly was not one to believe in legends. A seasoned hiker and nature photographer, she had explored trails across the country. Pine Hollow was just another forest to conquer, another place to capture the beauty of untouched nature. She arrived early one morning, her gear packed and her camera ready. The air was crisp, and the forest was eerily quiet. A single wooden sign marked the entrance to Whispering Loop. "Easy hike," she muttered, brushing off the uneasy feeling that crept over her. The trail was well trodden, lined with towering pines that stretched endlessly into the sky. The ground was soft with moss, and the occasional bird call broke the silence. Emma marveled at how untouched the area seemed, but after an hour of walking, she noticed something strange. The trees looked familiar, too familiar. A distinctive twisted pine with a lightning-scarred trunk caught her eye. She had passed it before. She checked her map and compass, frowning. Both seemed accurate, yet she couldn't shake the feeling she was retracing her steps. Determined not to let paranoia get the best of her, Emma pressed on. She set small markers along the trail, stones piled into cairns, broken twigs. But an hour later, she saw her own markers ahead of her. Her stomach sank. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself. "I must have doubled back somehow." She tried a different tactic, stepping off the trail to forge her own path. The underbrush was thick and the forest seemed darker off the beaten path, but Emma was confident she could find her way out. Yet no matter how far she wandered, she always ended up back on the trail, standing before the same twisted pine. The sun was still high, but the light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer. Emma decided to turn back the way she came, but after walking for another hour, she was horrified to find herself back at the starting point. The sign marking Whispering Loop stood mockingly in front of her. Panic began to set in. Emma pulled out her phone, only to find there was no signal. She checked her GPS, but it refused to load. "Okay, stay calm," she muttered, trying to steady her breathing. "It's just a trail. I can figure this out." As she sat down to rest, she heard it, a faint whispering, like wind brushing through the trees. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, fragmented voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Emma spun around, but there was no one there. Her heartbeat quickened. She packed up and started walking again, faster this time. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more insistent. Hours passed, though the position of the sun didn't seem to change. Emma's legs ached and her water supply was running low. She began to notice other strange things. Shadows moving in the corner of her vision. Figures standing just beyond the trees that vanished when she looked directly at them. The forest felt alive, watching her, toying with her. Her thoughts grew disjointed. She couldn't remember how long she had been on the trail. Days? Hours? It was all blending together. "Someone has to know I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone will come looking for me." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The world outside the forest felt distant, unreal. As night fell, Emma realized she had no choice but to stop and set up camp. The darkness was oppressive, the trees pressing closer than they had during the day. The whispers grew louder, now interspersed with laughter, childlike and cruel. Emma tried to block it out, huddling in her sleeping bag with her flashlight clutched in her hands. At some point, she fell into a restless sleep, only to awaken to the sound of footsteps circling her tent. "Who's there?" she shouted, unzipping the tent and shining her light into the darkness. The beam illuminated a figure standing just beyond the trees, a pale, emaciated figure with hollow eyes that stared right through her. Emma screamed and bolted, abandoning her gear as she ran blindly into the forest. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the trail. Gasping for breath, she looked up to see the twisted pine looming above her. It was then she realized the truth. She wasn't alone. The forest was full of others, lost souls trapped in the loop. In the dim light, she saw them emerge from the shadows. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes tattered. Some looked like they had been there for decades. One of them, a man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, crouched beside her. "There's no way out," he said softly. "Not unless the forest lets you go." "What does it want?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The man shook his head. "It doesn't want anything. It just is." Days or perhaps weeks passed. Emma stopped trying to escape. The forest was her world now. The whispers became her companions, the shadowy figures her only company. She began to change. Her thoughts grew slower, her memories of the outside world fading like a distant dream. The forest was all she knew, all she cared about. One day as she wandered the trail, she noticed a young man standing at the entrance to Whispering Loop. He looked eager, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Another one," Emma murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She watched as he stepped onto the trail, oblivious to the fate that awaited him. And the loop continued. The legend of Whispering Loop remains. Hikers occasionally disappear into Pine Hollow, their stories adding to the growing mystery. The locals no longer speak of it, but they know the truth. The forest doesn't just trap people, it absorbs them, making them part of its endless cycle. And for those who wander its cursed trail, there is no escape, only the eternal loop. In the small town of Willowmere, the old clock tower stood as a silent sentinel. Its rusted hands hadn't moved in decades, and its bells were thought to have long since fallen silent. It was a relic from another time, surrounded by ivy and whispers of forgotten histories. The townsfolk had grown used to its looming presence, a structure ignored and taken for granted. But one night, the clock tower chimed. It wasn't midnight or any other expected hour. The sound rang out at 3:47 a.m., a single mournful note that echoed through the town, waking residents from their sleep. The next morning, nobody spoke of the chime. They exchanged uneasy glances but dismissed it as a fluke. After all, the clock tower hadn't worked in years. But then it chimed again, and again, always at strange, irregular times. 2:13 a.m., 11:07 p.m., 4:56 a.m. The sound grew louder, more resonant, until it became impossible to ignore. Something had awakened within the tower. Eliza Harper, a young journalist, arrived in Willowmere on a cloudy afternoon. She'd been sent by her editor to investigate the peculiar reports coming out of the town. Strange noises, missing pets, and those haunting chimes. It was the kind of story that sold papers. Eliza wasn't superstitious. She believed there was always a logical explanation for every mystery. As she set her suitcase down in the quaint Willowmere Inn, she glanced out the window at the clock tower, its blackened face barely visible through the mist. "That thing," said the innkeeper, Mrs. Braithwaite, as she handed Eliza a key, "has been here longer than anyone can remember. Best to keep your distance." "Why?" Eliza asked, curious. Mrs. Braithwaite hesitated, her wrinkled hands tightening around the key. "Some things are better left alone." Eliza spent her first evening interviewing townsfolk. Most were reluctant to talk about the clock tower, brushing off her questions with nervous laughter or hurried excuses. But a few mentioned hearing the chimes late at night, describing them as unnervingly loud and carrying an eerie, mournful quality. That night, as Eliza sat in her room, poring over her notes, the first chime rang out. She froze, her pen hovering above her notepad. The sound was deep and resonant, as if the very air around her vibrated with its intensity. She checked her watch. 12:42 a.m. Curiosity overcame her. Grabbing her coat and flashlight, she ventured into the foggy streets, heading toward the clock tower. The closer she got, the louder the chimes became, though the clock face showed no movement. The hands were frozen at 6 o'clock, just as they had been in every old photo she'd seen of the tower. As she stood beneath it, staring up at the looming structure, the chimes stopped. And then she saw it, a faint light glowing from the tower's uppermost window. Determined to uncover the truth, Eliza returned the next day to investigate. The townsfolk warned her not to go, their fear palpable, but she brushed off their superstitions. The tower's entrance was locked, but the rusty padlock gave way after some effort. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew filled her nostrils. A spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into darkness. Climbing the steps, Eliza noticed strange markings etched into the walls, symbols she didn't recognize, accompanied by words in a language she couldn't read. She photographed them, her unease growing with each step. At the top, she found the bell room. The massive iron bell hung motionless, its surface tarnished and cracked. Yet as she approached, she felt a vibration in the air, as if the bell were alive. On the floor beneath it lay a journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. Opening it, she found the scrawled handwriting of someone named Arthur Greaves, a clockmaker who had once tended to the tower. The final entry sent a chill down her spine. The clock has been bound to the cycle. The chimes are warnings, not to be ignored. To stop them, one must face what lies beneath. Eliza returned to the inn, spending hours researching Arthur Greaves. She learned that he had vanished under mysterious circumstances nearly a century ago. The clock tower had stopped working shortly afterward, its purpose seemingly forgotten. The next night, the chimes rang again. This time, they were deafening, rattling windows and shaking walls. Eliza checked her watch. 3:15 a.m. She knew she had to act. Returning to the tower, she searched for anything that could explain Greaves's cryptic warning. Her flashlight beam caught the edge of a trap door beneath the bell. It creaked open to reveal a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The air grew colder as she climbed down, her flashlight flickering. At the bottom, she found herself in a cavernous chamber, filled with clockwork machinery, its gears rusted and motionless. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested an ornate pocket watch. Its hands moved erratically, spinning forward and backward, defying all logic. As she reached for it, a voice echoed through the chamber. "Do you hear it?" Eliza spun around, but no one was there. Shadows danced along the walls, taking on shapes that resembled human figures. "The cycle must not be broken," the voice continued, growing louder. You cannot silence time. Eliza realized the chimes weren't random. They were warnings, as Greaves had written. But warnings of what? As the shadows closed in, she grabbed the pocket watch. The room trembled and the machinery roared to life. The gears turned and the shadows recoiled, their anguished cries filling the chamber. The pocket watch grew hot in her hand, and visions flooded her mind. Arthur Greaves tinkering with the clock, a ritual gone wrong, the bell binding an ancient force meant to protect the town from something unimaginable. But over time, the force had grown restless, its power leaking into the world above. The chimes were a signal, a plea for someone to restore the balance. Eliza placed the pocket watch back on the pedestal, and the machinery slowed. The chimes above rang out one final time, 12 o'clock exactly. The shadows vanished and the air grew still. When she emerged from the tower, the fog had lifted, and the clock face above showed the correct time for the first time in decades. The townsfolk gathered, their fear replaced by awe as they watched the tower's hands move. Eliza explained what she could, though she left out the darkest details. Some mysteries, she realized, were better left unsolved. She left Willowmere the next day, the sound of the final chime still echoing in her ears. Though she moved on to other stories, she couldn't shake the feeling that the clock tower's warnings had been meant for more than just the town. Time, after all, waits for no one. There were warnings about the woods behind the village of Eldermore. The elders spoke of a path that shouldn't be followed, one hidden beneath moss and roots, shrouded in a veil of ancient curses. No one could say where it led, for those who dared tread it were never seen again. Legends told of an ancient family that once ruled the area, cursed by their own greed and pride. Their mansion, now crumbled into ruins, was said to be the source of the curse. The path was the only way to reach it, though the forest had long reclaimed its secrets. But legends had a way of becoming whispers, and whispers faded into forgetfulness. By the time Elise moved to Eldermore, the path was little more than a ghost story told to frighten children. Elise didn't believe in ghosts. Elise was an artist and a wanderer. After inheriting a small cottage on the edge of the village, she spent her days exploring the surrounding woods, sketching the gnarled trees and capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape. One misty morning, as she ventured deeper into the forest than usual, her foot caught on something hidden beneath the undergrowth. Brushing away the dirt and leaves, she uncovered old cobblestones, uneven and worn smooth by time. A path. It stretched ahead, winding through the trees like a forgotten vein, disappearing into the dense foliage. Intrigued, Elise followed it. The further she walked, the quieter the forest became. The birds stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The air grew cooler, and an unsettling feeling prickled at her skin, as if unseen eyes were watching her every step. When she reached a stone archway draped in vines, she hesitated. Carved into the arch were strange symbols, faded but still visible. She sketched them quickly, telling herself it was for her art, but deep down she felt an inexplicable pull to continue. The path led to a clearing where the ruins of a grand mansion stood. Its walls were crumbled, and ivy grew over its skeletal remains, but the air around it felt heavy, as though the ground itself bore the weight of sorrow. In the center of the ruins was a well, its stones blackened as if scorched by fire. On its edge, Elise found a rusted plaque inscribed with the same symbols she had seen on the arch. Beneath the symbols, in faint, almost illegible English, were the words, "Beware the curse of the bloodbound." Elise felt a chill but dismissed it as superstition. Yet when she leaned over the edge of the well, peering into its depths, she swore she heard whispers rising from the darkness. Returning to the village, Elise showed her sketches to the local historian, an elderly man named Mr. Cromwell. His face turned ashen when he saw the symbols. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said gravely. He explained the legend of the Blackthorn family, who had once lived in the mansion. The family was infamous for their cruelty and greed, amassing their fortune by exploiting the villagers. When the villagers rebelled, the Blackthorns turned to dark rituals, invoking an ancient power to protect themselves. But the power they summoned was treacherous. Instead of saving the family, it cursed them and the land they ruled. The mansion burned in a mysterious fire, and the surviving family members were said to have vanished into the woods, leaving behind only the cursed path and the well at the heart of their estate. The curse binds anyone who walks the path, Cromwell warned. It ties them to the Blackthorn's fate. Elise laughed nervously. It's just a story, isn't it? But Cromwell's eyes were grave. You should pray it is. That night, Elise began to dream of the path. In her dreams, the cobblestones were slick with blood, and shadowy figures loomed in the trees, their faces obscured. The whispers from the well grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. When she awoke, the symbols from the arch and the well were etched into her mind as clearly as if they had been burned there. She tried to focus on her art, but her sketches took a darker turn. Her hands seemed to move on their own, drawing the ruins, the well, and shadowy figures she hadn't seen in person. And then the whispers started while she was awake. Elise began to notice strange occurrences. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Objects in her cottage shifted positions. One evening, she heard footsteps outside her door, but when she opened it, no one was there. Only the faint scent of smoke, like a long extinguished fire. Desperate for answers, she returned to the ruins. The path seemed longer this time, and the air grew heavier with every step. When she reached the well, she saw a figure standing beside it, a man in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, his face pale and his eyes hollow. "Why have you come?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Elise froze. I don't know." "You have walked the path," he said, stepping closer. "Now you carry our burden." Before she could respond, the man vanished, dissolving into the shadows. Over the following days, Elise uncovered more of the curse's history. The Blackthorns had bound their souls to the land, ensuring they would never face judgment for their sins. But in doing so, they trapped themselves in a liminal state, unable to move on. The path served as a gateway, binding anyone who walked it to the Blackthorn's cursed existence. Those who strayed too far or stayed too long in the ruins became one with the shadows, their souls consumed by the curse. Elise realized with mounting dread that the curse was spreading to her. Determined to break the curse, Elise sought help from Cromwell. Together they studied ancient texts, searching for a way to sever the Blackthorn's hold on the land. They discovered that the well was the source of the curse. To break it, someone would need to descend into its depths and confront the spirits directly. Elise volunteered, knowing she might not return. Armed with a lantern and Cromwell's guidance, Elise entered the well. The air grew colder as she descended, the whispers growing louder until they were deafening. At the bottom, she found herself in a cavern filled with shadows. The spirits of the Blackthorns surrounded her, their faces twisted with anger and despair. "You cannot undo what has been done," they hissed, but Elise stood firm. "You've taken enough. It's time to let go." With trembling hands, she lit a small vial of oil, tossing it onto the cavern floor. Flames erupted, illuminating the shadows. The Blackthorns screamed, their forms dissolving in the light. When Elise emerged from the well, the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. The path behind her had crumbled, the cobblestones swallowed by the earth. The curse was broken. Though she remained haunted by the memories, Elise knew she had freed the village from its dark legacy. And as she packed her belongings to leave Eldermore, she sketched one final image: the ruins of the Blackthorn mansion, shrouded in light instead of shadow. For the first time, it looked peaceful. The small town of Greystone sat nestled in a valley perpetually blanketed by clouds. It was the kind of place where time seemed to crawl, where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth, and where the nights felt longer than they should. But one peculiar night changed everything. It began subtly, On the longest night of the year, the winter solstice, the sun had set at its usual time, the sky painted in streaks of crimson and deep indigo. The townsfolk retreated indoors, lighting fires and turning on lamps to keep the creeping cold at bay. But as the hours passed, something strange happened. Midnight came and went, yet the stars and moon refused to budge from their positions. The night lingered unnaturally, stretching into an endless expanse of darkness. At first, no one noticed. Most people were asleep, blissfully unaware of the passage of time. But for those who stayed awake, insomniacs, night shift workers, and restless souls, the unease grew. Emma Callahan, the town's sole night nurse, was among the first to realize something was wrong. She sat in the dimly lit hospital, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. and hadn't budged for hours. Her patient, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, stirred in his bed. His thin, papery voice broke the silence. "Something's wrong with the night," he muttered, his cloudy eyes staring out the window. "It doesn't want to end." Emma tried to reassure him, but deep down she felt it too. The night was stagnant, unnatural. By morning, or what should have been morning, the truth was undeniable. The sun never rose. The horizon remained shrouded in darkness, the stars frozen in place. Panic began to spread as more people realized the night was unending. At the local diner, a group of townsfolk gathered to discuss the phenomenon. Among them was Daniel Grayson, a local mechanic, and Marcy Quinn, the town's high school science teacher. "This has to be an eclipse or some kind of atmospheric event," Marcy reasoned, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "But how long can it last?" Daniel countered, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "It's been over 12 hours since sunrise should have come." No one had answers, only theories. But something else was happening, something darker. Those who stayed awake began to notice things. By the second day of endless night, those who had resisted sleep started to report strange occurrences. Shadows seemed to move independently, flickering in ways that defied the dim light of lanterns and flashlights. Emma, still at the hospital, noticed the shadows under Mr. Whitaker's bed, shifting unnaturally. She swore she saw them stretch toward him like grasping fingers. "Don't let them take me," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "They come for the ones who don't sleep." The warning sent a chill down Emma's spine. She began to hear faint whispers in the halls, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Meanwhile, Marcy began to piece together a chilling pattern. Through old journals and folklore she found in the town library, she discovered references to a phenomenon called the unbroken night. According to the tales, it was a curse that descended on those who defied the natural order of rest. "The night needs balance," she explained to the diner crowd. "Those who stay awake too long disturb that balance, and something comes to restore it." Her words were met with skepticism, but Emma and a few others believed her. The proof was in the growing reports of disappearances. People who had refused to sleep began to vanish, leaving behind only their shadows etched on the walls or floors, as if burned into existence. On the third day, the whispers became louder for those still awake. They carried promises of rest, of peace, of dreams so sweet they would erase the fear. Daniel, struggling to stay alert, saw his reflection in the window, but the reflection didn't mimic his movements. Instead, it smiled at him, a dark, knowing grin that wasn't his own. "Close your eyes, Daniel," it whispered. "You've been awake too long." The sleepless began to feel the weight of exhaustion crushing them, but they were too terrified to sleep, knowing the shadows waited. By the fifth day of the endless night, only a handful of townsfolk remained awake. Emma, Marcy, Daniel, and a few others barricaded themselves in the hospital, determined to find a way to survive. "We can't stay awake forever," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "What if we, I don't know, fight back somehow?" Emma shook her head. "You can't fight shadows, but maybe we can break the curse." She had found an old note among Marcy's research. The night ends when balance is restored. Sleep and let the darkness take its due. It was a gamble, but Emma believed the only way to end the endless night was to confront it, by surrendering to sleep. One by one, they agreed to try. Emma was the last to close her eyes, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The moment her eyelids fell, the world shifted. She found herself in a vast, shadowy landscape where the air hummed with an eerie energy. The others were there too, their forms shimmering like faint lights in the darkness. Around them, the shadows coalesced into towering figures with hollow, glowing eyes. "You defied the night," the largest shadow intoned. Its voice was like the groaning of ancient trees. "You must pay the toll." Emma stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "Take what you need, but end this. Let the sun rise again." The shadows paused, then reached out, their inky tendrils brushing against each of the dreamers. Emma felt a deep, soul-aching cold as a part of her was taken. Memories of warmth, of light, of laughter. But the shadows withdrew, satisfied. When Emma woke, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the hospital windows. The endless night had ended. The survivors were forever changed. They carried the weight of the shadow's touch, a lingering emptiness they couldn't explain. But the town of Greystone returned to normal, and the phenomenon became another whispered legend. For Emma, the memory of the shadows and their toll would never fade. She knew the night's hunger could return, and she prayed the balance would never be disturbed again. The first time it happened, Ethan Daniels thought it was a coincidence. A sudden downpour had drenched him on an otherwise clear afternoon. No clouds had been in sight when he left his apartment, but within moments the skies had darkened, thunder rolled, and rain hammered down. Oddly, no one else around him got wet. People walked past with amused smiles or concerned glances while he stood soaked to the bone. Ethan laughed it off as bad luck, but it wasn't the last time. Soon the storms followed him everywhere. By the third storm, Ethan knew something was wrong. He had gone to visit his sister Claire in the suburbs, hoping to escape the unpredictable weather that seemed to plague him. But as soon as he arrived, the skies darkened. A sharp wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the windows of her house. Claire looked outside, frowning. "I thought they said it was going to be sunny all week." Ethan tried to laugh it off. "Guess I brought it with me." Her dog, Max, growled low in his throat, staring at Ethan. He hadn't stopped since Ethan entered the house. When Ethan left later that night, the storm followed him back to the city. It wasn't until a week later that Ethan finally heard the truth. He was walking through the park, thunder rumbling overhead, when an old woman approached him. She wore a tattered raincoat, her face lined with age and worry. "You can feel it, can't you?" she asked. Ethan stopped, startled. "Feel what?" "The storm. It's not natural." He stared at her, unsure if she was a wandering eccentric or someone who knew more than she let on. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've been marked. The storm isn't just a storm, it's a hunter. It's coming for you." Ethan laughed nervously. "Okay, sure. Thanks for the heads up." But as he turned to leave, the woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You can't outrun it. The storm won't stop until it has what it wants." "What does it want?" he demanded, fear creeping into his voice. She shook her head. "You'll have to figure that out yourself. But be warned, the longer you resist, the stronger it gets." The next storm was worse than any Ethan had experienced. Lightning struck dangerously close, illuminating his apartment in blinding flashes. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and doors. Desperate for answers, Ethan began to dig into his past. He scoured old photos, journals, and keepsakes, searching for anything that might explain why he was being targeted. That's when he found it, a letter from his late grandfather, buried in the bottom of a dusty box. The letter spoke of a family curse, passed down through generations. Ethan's great-grandfather, a farmer, had wronged someone, an old hermit who lived on the edge of town. The hermit had cursed their bloodline, vowing that a storm would one day claim them. Ethan had dismissed the story as a family myth when he first read it years ago. But now, with the storm outside raging, the words felt chillingly real. Ethan knew he couldn't face the storm alone. He reached out to Claire, explaining everything as best he could. "I know it sounds insane," he said, pacing her living room, "but I think this storm is part of a curse. It's hunting me." Claire frowned but didn't laugh. She had seen the storms that followed Ethan, the way they seemed to center around him. "Okay," she said slowly. "Let's say you're right. How do we stop it?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but there has to be a way. Maybe someone in town knows more about the curse." Together, they began to research the hermit mentioned in the letter. They found old records and newspaper clippings about a man named Elias Greaves, who had lived in isolation for most of his life. Elias had been accused of witchcraft and blamed for several misfortunes in the community before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Guided by the old records, Ethan and Claire tracked down the location of Elias's former cabin, deep in the woods outside town. The storm intensified as they approached, the wind whipping through the trees and rain slashing against their faces. The cabin was little more than a ruin, overgrown with moss and ivy. Inside, they found symbols carved into the walls, spirals, eyes, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the storm. Suddenly, the air grew icy. The rain stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then a voice echoed through the cabin. "You've come," it said, low and resonant. Ethan turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its form shifting like smoke. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan demanded. "What do you want from me?" The figure's eyes glowed faintly. "Your bloodline wronged me. Now I take what I am owed." Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't fight the storm, but maybe he could reason with it. "What if I could make it right?" he said. "What if I could undo the harm my family caused?" The shadowy figure tilted its head, considering. "The harm cannot be undone, but perhaps a bargain can be made." "What kind of bargain?" Ethan asked warily. The figure extended a hand, its fingers wreathed in mist. "Your freedom in exchange for another." Ethan's stomach turned. "You want me to sacrifice someone else?" "Someone who carries no guilt," the figure said. "An innocent life, freely given. That is the price." Ethan stared at the figure, his mind racing. Could he live with himself if he condemned someone else to save his own life? Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. "Don't do it, Ethan. There has to be another way." But the storm was closing in, the air around them growing colder by the second. Ethan felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the inevitability of his fate. "I can't," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I won't trade someone else's life for mine." The figure's eyes narrowed. "Then you will face the storm." As the figure vanished, the storm surged, a maelstrom of wind and ice. But as Ethan braced himself, he realized something had changed. The storm wasn't attacking him, it was retreating. The whispers faded, replaced by an uneasy calm. Slowly the skies cleared, revealing a pale dawn. Ethan and Claire stood in silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. "It lets you go," Claire said finally. "Maybe refusing the bargain was the answer," Ethan replied. "Maybe the storm needed to see that I wouldn't pass the curse on to someone else." The storms never returned, but Ethan knew better than to believe he was entirely free. He spent the rest of his life trying to make amends, helping others in ways both big and small. And every time the wind howled or thunder rumbled in the distance, he felt a shiver of fear, wondering if the storm might one day return to collect its due.